Hello everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. So today I'm going to be addressing another question that someone asked me. I've been asked if I could talk about haemovigilance, and hopefully I'm going to try to explain this as simple as I could. But before we get into that, my name is Dr. Emmanuel Ogbodo. I've been working in the UK as a specialty biomedical scientist, and I'm also a lecturer in biomedical science here in the United Kingdom. So now let's look at what is haemovigilance. Now, before I go into the definition of haemovigilance, can I first of all tell you there are two key words there. One is hem, two is vigilance. So when you look at hem talks about blood. Vigilance means there's a surveillance, there is a monitoring, there is a regulation. Okay, so you want to know how something is happening, to regulate a system or to regulate what is going on, or the surveillance system of the blood. That then talks about haemovigilance, because hem is blood, vigilance means surveillance. But now let me give you idea before I can define it. Now when you look at haemovigilance, the regulation here we're talking about, or the surveillance we're talking about, is not just the blood. Okay, looking at the blood, what we're looking at is specifically maybe when it has to do something like blood transfusion. So sometimes they may ask you the question this way. They may say, what is haemovigilance in blood transfusion? So in blood transfusion, what it means is that because it has to do with the aspect where a patient is transfused with a blood product. In haemovigilance, what we are looking at then, or what is being looked at in haemovigilance, has to do with when the blood is donated, who actually donate the blood. So we're looking at the donor, we're looking at the donation. Okay, now following the donation, processing the blood product. Remember, from the whole blood, you can process it into different units, such as red blood cells, platelets, leukocytes, FFP, and cryoprecipitate. Once it's been processed, now you provide the blood component. So meaning that you issue the blood component, provide it to be used so that someone can have it, so that a patient can be transfused with it. So it has to, you now have to do, you process it, then you provide it, which is a provision of the blood component. But because it's been provided, then that means it can then be transfused to a patient. Okay, and once it's transfused to a patient, you now double check by doing a follow-up whether or not that blood product benefits the patient, or did it cause any harm to the patient. So when you now look at monitoring each of these stages that I've mentioned, that is called haemovigilance. So now what is haemovigilance, or how can you define haemovigilance? It can be defined as a surveillance procedure covering the entire blood transfusion chain, from donation, processing of this blood component, provision of the blood component, issuing the blood component or transfusing the blood component to the patient, and then follow up to see whether or not that blood unit benefit the patient, or whether there's a problem with it. So that is haemovigilance. And what it means that in that follow-up, if you look at my previous video on recall, NHSBT recall, so that is a form of follow-up. So even though it's been donated, if a patient receives that blood and there's a transfusion reaction, it can be followed up, okay? Or even though it's been donated and processed, if there is anything that suggests that it might have a potential hazard, it can then be stopped. That is haemovigilance. So in summary then, haemovigilance has to do with the process or procedure that monitor the blood component from the donation up to the time it's been transfused, okay? And also the follow-up of whether or not it benefits that patient or not. That is haemovigilance. What is the benefit of haemovigilance? Number one, haemovigilance can improve donor, okay? Meaning with the help of the haemovigilance, okay, it can improve donor. Why? Because if there's any problem with the sample, because the donor may not even know there's an issue with the blood product, okay, with his system, but by the time that he or she has donated blood, okay, if there is anything that is detected, the donor will be made aware, and of course that can now help to manage that donor very well. So it can improve donor, it can improve the patient, which are the recipients, and obviously how it can improve the patient has to do with that, with the patient condition. For example, if someone have a low platelet and you give him platelet, that will improve the patient. Or the person is anemic, you give the person red cells. Haemovigilance can improve transfusion appropriateness. In other words, making sure that the transfusion occur when it should happen. Okay, remember that For someone to receive a blood product, it has to really be necessary. Okay, so Haemovigilance also monitor that to make sure that the blood transfusion is appropriate. Okay, Haemovigilance also ensure there's a reduction in the blood component wastage. Okay, that is why following the donation, Haemovigilance see to it, did anybody receive the blood or blood product or not? Haemovigilance will help to know whether there's a wastage or not. In other words, when somebody donate blood, okay, with the help of the Haemovigilance, we can know, did that blood, was it actually received by a patient or was it wasted, as the case may be. These are the benefits of Haemovigilance. Now, in Haemovigilance, you are looking at maybe the local hospital and the national. In other words, the national, when you look at people that monitor the Haemovigilance, especially when you talk about something like MHRA, which is Medicine Health Regulatory Agency, okay? So they also play a role in this very Haemovigilance. They monitor the Haemovigilance. They want to see what is going on. Is one of their core, roles and responsibility is Haemovigilance. So they monitor that. So you are looking at the national, okay? National Haemovigilance. Then you also look at the local Haemovigilance. Under the local Haemovigilance, you are looking at a number of factors such as observe. So that means the blood product will be observed. Now you look at detection, meaning if there's any problem with the blood product, it will be detected. Now you look at following the detection of that, it can then be investigated, okay? And following the investigation, it can be documented. Following the documentation, a notification can be submitted. So meaning that whatever thing that is found out, whatever thing that has been detected has been documented. And following the documentation, okay, there can be a notification to the national body, maybe something like MHRA, okay? Now, following the notification, you can have correct and preventive action or measure, okay? So meaning, how do we correct this? How do we prevent this from happening in future? And of course, one of the corrective ways may have to do with education. So education can come in from what has been found out. How do we prevent this, okay? Okay, how do we make sure that this does not happen again? How do we correct this? Now, education or training may come in. So once that has been put in place, it can then be monitored to see whether or not it's effective. Now, if I'm to itemize it, number one, when it comes to local, which can be either maybe NHSBT themselves or maybe the local hospital, as the case may be. So the local Haemovigilance has to do with number one, observation, number two, detection, number three, investigation, number four, documentation, number five, notification or submit notification to the national bodies, number six, corrective and preventive action or measure, number seven, education or training, okay? Now, number eight, monitoring. So you monitor the process. Now, that is for local Haemovigilance. Now, let us look at national Haemovigilance. So in national Haemovigilance, they are the one that will now, kind of put a regulation in place. They're going to determine and define the data set and the terms. In other words, those policies that they will make to make sure that Haemovigilance, put in place to ensure that overall it will benefit the patient, okay? That is what this national will do. Like, for example, in the case of MHRA, they have a lot of regulation, like I've mentioned on my previous videos. They have regulations, okay, to see that this Haemovigilance is effective, and if there's any potential hazard, that is going to be detected. And if there is any hazard that occur, it should also be reported to them. That way they can be able to, look at it and see where that can be prevented for future occurrence. I hope that makes sense. So under the national, you are looking at them defining the data set, defining the terms, okay, of the Haemovigilance. So we mentioned that under the local process, there are going to be a kind of notification. So if they notify the national, then that means the national will then receive that notification, which is number two, receiving of the notification. Once they receive the notification, they can then analyze what has been received, what is the complaint, what has been documented, what is really the problem. They will then analyze it, okay? And from the analysis, they can then conclude, okay, based on their own professional judgment, they can then conclude overall what they think about the process of what has been submitted to them or reported to them. And that would then lead to them sending a report, okay, and to the people where they received the notification from. And of course, that would then lead to the recommendation. Can I even say that it is this recommendation that lead to a number of guidelines that we've seen in blood bank? So that is what happened in Haemovigilance when you look at the local and national. So the national, number one, is define the data set and also the terms. Number two is receive the notification. Number three is to analyze. Number four, to conclude their analysis, whatever thing they analyze, to conclude it. Then number 5, send a report and of course give a recommendation. So remember, some of these notifications like we've highlighted, okay, if there's anything that is detected, either before the donation, during the donation, okay, during processing of the sample of the blood component, or during issuing of the blood component, or after it has been issued, or when the patient is transfused, or after the patient transfusion, any of these phases or levels of hemovigilance, if there is anything that is detected that may be potentially hazard to a patient, or that is already a hazard to the patient, that has to be reported, okay, to this very national body. For example, something like MHRA. And that is where we can look at serious hazard of transfusion, which is called short. So short is very vital aspect of MHRA, because this is where this potential hazard or any of these hazards will be, will be analyzed, and from the analysis, it can now help to see what are the percentage of what is occurring within the country, for example, in the United Kingdom. And that is why short can be defined as confidential inquiry into the serious hazard of transfusion. Now, it is that inquiry, that confidential inquiry, that lead to a lot of report, okay, that short analyze, which is a vital aspect of MHRA. Now, let me try to, itemize or outline the possible hazard, okay, that may be associated with the blood transfusion. Some of them I had already mentioned, okay. For example, the obvious one is something like, blood transfusion reaction. So once there's a blood transfusion reaction, okay, that should be reported to the MHRA. That should be reported, and that report should then be analyzed, okay, and that should be, be reported on short, okay. The short will then give the percentage of the blood transfusion that is occurring within the country, and of course that will be investigated to know why that is the case. And like I've said, that is why there's a lot of guidelines in blood bank to make sure that these things are checkmated to continue to provide safe blood product to the patient. Now, let me try to outline it. There's a lot of them, but example of some of the incidents that may be analyzed under short include, remember, this might have to do with maybe potential hazard or hazard that has already occurred. For example, you have TRALI, which is transfusion-related acute lung injury. Then you have TACO, which is transfusion-associated circulatory overload. Then you have transfusion-associated graft versus host disease. Then you have hemolytic transfusion reaction. Then you can have delayed transfusion, under transfusion, post-transfusion purpura, transfusion transmitted infection, handling and storage error. Now, I've already said a lot of these things in my previous video, but let me just give you an example. When you talk about something like transfusion associated graft versus host disease, what happens sometimes during the preparation of the blood product, okay, what then happens is there can be an introduction of leukocytes such as lymphocyte in that blood product. Now, what happens is that if that leukocyte, like lymphocyte, okay, during the blood transfusion or platelet transfusion, or as the case may be, get into the system, now what the body will do is that it will fight the lymphocyte and take that away. But what happens is that where there's immunocompromise, like as you can see in a cancer patient, in a case of immunocompromise, this lymphocyte, which is leukocyte, will then be there, okay? That is where you talk about something like human leukocytic antigen. So this very lymphocyte, once transfused along with the blood product, okay, now may now start attacking the patient or attacking the recipient, and that may now lead to a problem. And that is why it then has to be prevented, okay? So when you look at the transfusion-associated graft versus host disease, that is what happened. Because of the condition of the host, the immune system has been compromised, and if you transfuse that patient, okay, the lymphocyte that is being introduced to that patient following that transfusion may cause a problem. And that is why in blood transfusion we can do a special treatment on such blood product to make sure that is handled. When we talk about something like HLA matched blood product, okay, like HLA matched platelet, or we look at something like irradiated blood product, like irradiated red blood cells or irradiated platelet. So this irradiated blood product or HLA matched, okay, is to be able to take care of this very transfusion associated graft versus host disease. I hope this makes sense. Now, when you look at something like TACO, what you are looking at is where there's overload of the blood product in a patient. Once the patient has had too much blood transfusion, that may lead to what we call tackle. And of course, when you look at the trolley, you are looking at during the transfusion process, okay, the effect, is there any negative effect it has on the lung, okay? So once it causes any form of lung injury, and some of them may be associated with maybe there's a bacterial infection, as the case may be, once it affects, the lung, okay, and cause an injury, that is then called trolley. In hemolytic transfusion reaction, you're looking at maybe where there's a transfusion reaction following maybe issuing any form of incompatible unit, or maybe once a unit is issued to a patient or transfused to a patient and that unit is not compatible with that patient, leading to hemolysis, that is then called hemolytic transfusion reaction. And this can be commonly seen when you look at maybe IgG antibody antigen incompatibility, okay, or maybe IgM incompatibility, which means that when you talk about something like intravascular hemolysis or extravascular hemolysis, that is where hemolytic transfusion reaction comes in. Now, another thing I'm going to mention is in terms of maybe during the transfusion and maybe if not detected, okay, before transfusion, and maybe during that process, a patient has now been transfused with a blood product that is infected with a bacteria or viral, as the case may be. That is then known as transfusion transmitted infection. Now, another aspect of this very incident that can be reported to short is the handling and storage error. So meaning that, remember that each of these very blood components, they have storage temperatures. When a blood is collected as a whole, it has its own temperature. It has its own recommended temperature of storage. However, once it's separated into different components, they can then have different sub-storage recommendation. For example, the red blood cell has a different storage temperature when compared with that of the FFP or cryoprecipitate or maybe platelet, okay? And if you've not watched my video on blood component storage temperature, you can watch it. Now, what it means that if there is any error, okay, in that storage of that very blood component, that may lead to wastage. That may be a potential hazard if any patient is transfused with that very blood product. And because of storage is very, very important, this can now lead me to what we call cold chain. So when you're looking at the cold chain in blood bank, what exactly are you talking about? Some of you have gone for an interview and they ask you what is cold chain, or they say what is cold chain in blood bank. Let me give you a background. Cold chain has to do with that. From the time that the blood has been donated, storing it to the appropriate temperature. Now you separate it, you now store the blood component into the appropriate temperature, okay? Now, once it has been processed and is about to be issued, when you issue the blood, even during the transportation, because when the NHSBT issue the blood, it will be transported to the hospital that requests for that very blood product. Now, you also need to make sure that you keep the blood product to the recommended temperature. That is still the chain. You now transport it to the hospital. When they receive it, they also make sure that within that hospital or laboratory, they also store it at the appropriate temperature, okay? And also, when they issue the blood to the patient, okay, when the blood is taken out, okay, it will also be stored at the appropriate temperature. That is why if you go to maybe in the ward in the hospital, some of them have got a side fridge. So sometimes when a blood is issued to them, they don't transfuse the patient immediately. But then because they have a side fridge, they will also keep it in a fridge, okay, before it can then be transfused to the patient. What are they doing? They are trying to maintain the cold chain. Meaning that when you store a blood product, okay, in appropriate temperature from the donation to the time that the patient receives it, you are looking at the chain. So you are looking at those chain of the storage, those steps or those phases that ensure that each of these blood products appropriately stored, even following the blood donation, is called cold chain. Okay, now let us define cold chain. Cold chain can then be defined as storing and transporting blood and blood products within the correct temperature range and conditions from point of collection from a donor to the point of transfusion to the patient. Now, what is important of cold chain is to ensure that perishable products are safe and of high quality at the point of consumption. So that is why it is very, very important to make sure that this very blood product, because it's perishable, we need to make sure that at the point of consumption, at the point of transfusion, that it is still safe and it is of high quality. That's the benefit or importance of cold chain. Let us look at the three main components of cold chain. 1. Transportation and storage equipment. 2. Trained personnel. 3. Efficient management procedure. So the way the procedure is being effectively managed. Now, what are the types of cold chain? We have three main types of cold chain. You have active active cold chain, you have passive cold chain, then you have hybrid cold chain. Under the active cold chain, you're looking at mechanical or electrical system that is powered by energy source. Now, when you look at phase change materials, you're looking at things like water and ice or dry ice, because these materials, they can change from one state to another. Does that make sense? Whenever you look at that aspect of maintaining, a cold chain by using phase change material, that is called passive cold chain. Now, when you look at the hybrid cold chain, it makes use of the two of them. Okay, it makes of both the active and the passive. That is why it is a combination of phase change material and thermostatic control. Now, let us look at the steps involved in cold chain. The 4 steps involved in cold chain. Number 1, planning. Number 2, producing. Number 3, monitoring. And number 4, transporting. So with them mean that in Haemovigilance there is cold chain. Now, because of that, it is also important to mention that sometimes you may go for interview. They may not be asking you about cold chain in blood bank. They may be asking you what is cold chain. I want you to know that it is not only the blood product that can undergo cold chain. Think about any other perishable product in the laboratory, okay? Whether it is maybe reagent, okay, quality control protein or plasma protein, calibration sample, control sample, any of the materials that is used in the laboratory, they all have different storage temperature. So when you also look at other materials in the laboratory, which look at monitoring the appropriate storage temperature or ensuring the appropriate storage temperature of any material in the laboratory from the point it is being produced to the point it's being used, that is also called cold chain. When you look at the cold chain, it can be significantly about the blood product, okay? However, it can also be applicable to other materials used in the laboratory. And once the temperatures are monitored in any laboratory materials used in the laboratory, okay, from the time that material is produced to the time that material is used up, that is also seen as cold chain. And that is why if you come to the laboratory, one of the common things that is done in the pathology laboratory is to make sure that every materials or whether quality control or reagent are stored at appropriate temperature. So that is to maintain its cold chain. Cold chain, therefore, is not just about the blood transfusion. It can also have to do with other materials used in pathology laboratory. I hope this makes sense. So here you go. That is your Haemovigilance and cold chain. Hopefully, I've been able to explain this as simple as I can. Okay, so please let me know what you think about the video by putting up a comment on the comment section. Please, can I ask you to like, share, and subscribe? If you appreciate the content, you can also select on Super Tank, okay? And also you can decide to join any membership of the YouTube channel by clicking on the join icon. So here you go. Thank you very much, and I wish you all the best. Bye-bye.